In March 2017, a Florida courtroom became the stage for a decision that would destroy one man's future forever. Kendrick Morris walked in believing he might regain a piece of his life. Instead, he walked out with something far more terrifying than his original sentence. He was condemned to life in prison. And the most disturbing part is that this nightmare began because he asked the court for another chance. Today, Morris wakes up every morning in a prison cell knowing that every day ahead of him will be identical. No finish line, no release date, no future beyond concrete walls and steel bars. Many people believe life in prison is the humane alternative to execution. At least you are alive, they say. But by the end of this video, you may question whether that belief is true at all. And I want you to comment below and tell me what you think after hearing the full story. But first, we need to understand how Kendrick Morris ended up trapped in a punishment some believe is worse than death itself. Back in 2008, Kendrick Morris was only 16 years old when he carried out an act of violence so brutal that prosecutors struggled to put it into words. Outside a public library in Bloomingdale, Florida, he attacked Queen Afua in broad daylight. What happened next would permanently destroy her life. The assault left Queen blind, paralyzed, and unable to speak. She requires 24-hour medical care to this day, trapped in a body that no longer responds the way it should. At the time, Morris was legally a juvenile, but the severity of the crime erased any sense of youthfulness or immaturity. In 2011, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. For many people, that already sounded like a life sentence. But the American justice system was in the middle of a massive shift. Around that time, the United States Supreme Court issued several landmark rulings on juvenile sentencing. The court argued that teenagers were not the same as adults. Their brains were still developing. They were more impulsive, more influenced by their environment, and more capable of rehabilitation. As a result, the court decided that extremely long sentences for juveniles without the possibility of parole could be unconstitutional. These decisions opened the door for thousands of young offenders to seek reduced sentences and parole opportunities. In 2017, Morris and his attorneys decided to take that chance. They returned to court, hoping that the system would recognize his growth and transformation. They believed he could receive a reduced sentence, maybe 20 years, maybe 30, something that would give him a realistic chance to experience life outside prison walls. To support their argument, they brought in psychologists and experts who testified that Morris had changed. He earned his high school diploma while incarcerated. His IQ tested at 114, above average intelligence. His prison record was almost spotless, with no major disciplinary incidents. The experts argued that he was capable of rehabilitation, that he could reintegrate into society, that he was no longer the same person who committed the crime as a teenager. For a moment, it seemed like Morris might actually receive mercy. The courtroom listened as his defense team painted a picture of transformation, of growth, of a teenager who had made an unforgivable mistake but had matured into a different person. This was exactly the type of case the Supreme Court rulings were meant to address. Then Judge Chad Tharp delivered his decision. Instead of reducing Morris's sentence, he increased it. The 65-year sentence was replaced with life in prison. No parole. No release date. No chance at freedom. In one moment, Morris's attempt to seek mercy became the very event that sealed his fate forever. The judge's message was unmistakable. Morris would never walk free. He would die behind bars. Most people hear the phrase life sentence and imagine a man quietly sitting in a cell, waiting out his days. But that image is misleading. The reality of life imprisonment is far darker, far more psychologically destructive, and far more terrifying than most people realize. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and knowing with absolute certainty that you will spend the next 50 or 60 years in the same small cell. Not as a temporary punishment, not as a chapter in your life, but as your entire existence until death. No milestones, no freedom, no chance for change, just an endless repetition of the same day. Morris is housed in a Florida maximum security facility, one of the harshest environments in the American prison system. In these facilities, inmates are often confined to their cells for up to 23 hours a day. The cells are typically 6 feet by 9 feet, roughly the size of a small bathroom. Now imagine spending 23 hours a day in your bathroom. Not for a week, not for a year, but for decades. Morris gets 1 hour outside his cell each day. 1 hour to shower, exercise, and briefly interact with other human beings. The remaining 23 hours are spent alone with concrete walls, steel bars, and silence. Florida is one of the largest users of solitary confinement in the United States. At any given time, tens of thousands of inmates are held in restrictive housing or isolation. The purpose is control, but the psychological consequences are severe. Studies show that solitary confinement dramatically increases the risk of mental illness, self-harm, and premature death. More than half of all self-harm-related deaths in custody occur in solitary confinement. Isolation is not an accident. It is a tool, and it is designed to break people down. Charles Dickens, after visiting American prisons in the 19th century, described solitary confinement as worse than physical torture. He called it a slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain. Nearly 200 years later, the structure of isolation has changed very little. Morris has lived in this reality since 2011. Every morning, he wakes up to the same walls, the same bars, the same silence. Unlike death row inmates who at least have a timeline, Morris has no end date. There is no moment when the suffering stops. His punishment is not a countdown. It is an endless present. Psychologists call this temporal death. The future is erased. There are no long-term plans, no retirement dreams, no family milestones, no sense of progression. Just a continuous loop of existence without purpose. Research shows that the absence of hope causes profound psychological damage, often leading to learned helplessness, where a person stops trying because they see no possibility of change. Morris is now in his early 30s. If he lives to 75 or 80, he has 40 to 50 more years of this life ahead of him. Tens of thousands of days spent in the same cell, eating the same food, hearing the same sounds, living the same routine. Try to imagine that. Try to imagine 40 more years of your life spent in a bathroom-sized cell with 1 hour of freedom per day. And this is only the beginning of what life without parole truly means. But the physical confinement is only part of the punishment. The deeper torture is psychological. It is what happens to the mind when a human being is removed from normal existence and placed into a controlled environment where nothing changes and nothing matters. Morris did not just lose his freedom. He lost his identity, his social role, his future, and his connection to the world. Before prison, he was a teenager with friends, family, routines, and possibilities. After prison, he became an inmate number in a system designed to strip individuality away. Human beings are social creatures. Our brains evolved to live in groups, to communicate, to touch, to belong. When that is taken away, the brain begins to break down. In maximum security prisons, inmates are often separated not just from society, but from each other. Conversations are limited. Movement is controlled. Touch is almost non-existent. Morris can receive visits from family members, but even those visits are heavily restricted. In many maximum security facilities, visits occur through thick glass partitions. No hugs, no handshakes, no physical contact. Imagine not touching another human being for years. Imagine never hugging your mother, never shaking a friend's hand, never feeling the warmth of another person. Former inmates who spent years in solitary confinement have described it as a living death. One man who spent 18 years in isolation said he forgot how to hold a normal conversation. He said his thoughts became fragmented, his memory faded, and he struggled to recognize his own reflection in the mirror. Simple tasks that most people take for granted, like ordering food or using a smartphone, became overwhelming and terrifying. The person Morris was at 16 is gone. The person he is now has been shaped by years of isolation, surveillance, and deprivation. Psychologists describe this as institutionalization, where a person becomes so adapted to prison life that they lose the ability to function in normal society. For Morris, that may not even matter because the system has decided he will never leave. Sensory deprivation plays a major role in this process. In a small cell with plain walls, limited sounds, and repetitive routines, the brain receives very little stimulation. Over time, this can lead to hallucinations, anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline. Some inmates talk to themselves just to hear a human voice. Others create imaginary companions to cope with the loneliness. Sleep becomes irregular. Time loses meaning. Days blur together. Weeks feel like months. Months feel like years. Without milestones, without events, without change, the mind struggles to maintain a sense of reality. This is why some experts refer to life without parole as social death. The person is physically alive, but socially, psychologically, and emotionally erased. They exist, but they no longer participate in the human world. Morris also faces the slow erosion of relationships. His family will age. His parents will grow old.
Relatives will die.
Children and grandchildren he may never have will grow up without him. Holidays, birthdays, weddings, funerals, all will pass without his presence. Over time, visits may become less frequent. Phone calls may become shorter. The outside world moves on. He remains frozen in time. And then there is the looming date in the future. The sentencing review scheduled for 2031. On paper, it looks like hope. A review. Possibility. A chance for the system to reconsider. But hope can be dangerous in prison. It can keep a person alive, but it can also deepen despair when it is taken away. Judge Chad Tharp included the review provision when he sentenced Morris to life. It was meant to comply with legal requirements regarding juvenile offenders. But experts believe the chances of Morris being released are extremely small. The severity of the crime, the judge's statements, and the victim's impact make parole unlikely. So Morris has lived for years with a small flicker of hope. 2031. Maybe 2031. But what happens when that year arrives and the review panel denies his release? What happens when the system officially confirms what he has already suspected? That he will die in prison. Psychologists call this false hope one of the most painful psychological experiences. It creates a cycle of anticipation and disappointment that can be more damaging than hopelessness itself. It keeps a person emotionally invested in a future that may never exist. When that future is taken away, the emotional collapse can be devastating. Now, it is important to be clear. What Morris did was horrific. The victim, Queen Afu, lost everything in that attack. She cannot see, walk, or speak. She requires 24-hour medical care. Her life was stolen from her in an instant. Her sister, Anna Donato, described the impact in court. She said Queen also received a life sentence. And she was right. Queen's life will never return to what it was. Her family will care for her for the rest of her life. They will watch her age, suffer, and depend on others for everything. When Morris was resentenced, Anna Donato said justice was served. But she also said something that captured the tragedy of the situation. She said both lives were now sentenced to life, and that it was a sad and unfortunate situation for everyone involved. That is the reality. 2 lives destroyed. 1 victim suffering every day in a broken body. 1 perpetrator suffering every day in a broken system. The question is not whether Morris deserves punishment. He does. The question is what kind of punishment society believes is just, humane, and meaningful. Life without parole forces a person to endure decades of psychological and physical deterioration. It forces them to watch time pass while their life stands still. It forces them to confront a future that no longer exists. And for Morris, this is only the middle of the story. He still has decades ahead of him, decades in the same cell, decades in the same routine, decades in the same isolation. This is what life imprisonment really looks like. And that is the part most people never think about. Life without parole is not just a sentence. It is a slow erosion of identity. Over decades, the mind changes. Memory fades. Hope disappears. Purpose dissolves. You do not just lose freedom. You lose your future. Every birthday becomes meaningless. Every year blends into the next. Time becomes a weapon used against you. The system does not just take your body. It takes your sense of self. And when you remove hope from a human being, something fundamental breaks inside them. Many inmates describe life without parole as being buried alive but forced to stay conscious for the rest of their existence. No milestones. No second chances. No redemption story. Just an endless present that never moves forward. So when people say life imprisonment is merciful, ask yourself what mercy really means. Is mercy letting someone breathe while destroying everything that makes life worth living? Is mercy watching someone decay slowly instead of ending their suffering quickly? Is mercy decades of isolation, institutional routines, psychological decline, and the knowledge that nothing will ever change? Or is that just cruelty stretched across time? Think about Kendrick Morris sitting in that cell right now, not thinking about tomorrow because tomorrow will be identical to today. Not thinking about the future because the future has been erased. Not thinking about freedom because freedom is a concept that no longer applies to his life. That is the punishment. That is the sentence. That is what life without parole actually means. Is the purpose of prison to rehabilitate offenders? In Morris's case, the experts believed he could change. The psychologists testified that his brain was still developing, that he had matured, that he was capable of reform. But the judge rejected that idea completely. So if rehabilitation is not the goal, then what is? Is the purpose to protect society? Morris is locked away, and the public is safe from him. But safety comes at a cost. Decades of isolation, decades of psychological decay, decades of a human being slowly deteriorating in a concrete box. Is that protection? Or is it something else entirely? Is the purpose to punish? If so, Morris's punishment may be more severe than execution. He is forced to endure day after day of confinement, silence, and mental erosion. A punishment that does not end, that does not fade, that does not allow healing. Or is the purpose revenge? To make the offender suffer as long as possible, to stretch pain across an entire lifetime? These are not simple questions, and reasonable people can disagree. But what cannot be denied is that life without parole in maximum security is not mercy. It is not a humane alternative. It is a different kind of death sentence, one that unfolds slowly over decades instead of minutes. If you were in Morris's position, what would you choose? A lifetime in a 6 by 9 foot cell, 23 hours a day alone, no release date, no future, or a comparatively quick execution? Really think about that. 40 to 50 years of isolation. 40 to 50 years of watching your mind and body decay. Many people, when faced with that choice, would choose death because a life without hope, without purpose, without connection to humanity is barely a life at all. Some philosophers argue that life imprisonment without parole is more cruel than the death penalty precisely because it extends suffering for an entire lifetime. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, yet courts have repeatedly upheld life without parole as constitutional. They ask whether the sentence fits the crime, but rarely ask whether the conditions of that sentence amount to psychological torture. If someone spends decades in isolation, if they lose their identity, their sanity, and their connection to the world, is that not torture in another form? As of today, Kendrick Morris is in his early 30s. He has already spent more than a decade behind bars, and if you count from his arrest, nearly half his life has been consumed by prison. He has a sentencing review scheduled for 2031, but all signs suggest it will change nothing. He will likely be denied. He will likely spend the rest of his life in that cell. The judge made his position clear. The prosecutors made their stance clear. The victim's family made their feelings clear. Morris is never supposed to be free. So he wakes up every morning knowing this is it. No second chapter. No redemption story. Just an endless repetition of the same day until his final breath. So I ask you again. Is this more humane than the death penalty? Is 50 years of psychological isolation really better than execution? Some of you will say yes. He deserves every second of suffering for what he did to Queen Afu. And that perspective is understandable. His crime destroyed her life and shattered her family forever. Justice matters. Accountability matters. But others will question whether any human being, regardless of their crimes, should be subjected to decades of mental and emotional destruction. Whether this form of punishment serves justice or simply satisfies our desire for revenge. Whether a system that warehouses human beings until they die is truly justice or something much darker. There are no easy answers. This case forces us to confront what we believe about justice, mercy, and what it means to be human. After researching this case and understanding what life in maximum security really looks like, it is difficult to see life imprisonment as the merciful alternative it is often portrayed as. It is a slow unraveling of a person, stretched across decades, so tell me in the comments. After hearing this story, do you think life imprisonment is more humane than the death penalty? Or is it worse? Has your perspective changed? Kendrick Morris will face his sentencing review in 2031. That moment will decide whether the justice system believes he deserves any chance at redemption. But based on everything we know, that day will likely confirm what he already understands. He will die in prison. The only question is how many more decades of suffering he will endure before that happens. This is the reality of life without parole. This is what it truly means. And now you have to decide whether this is justice or whether it is something far more disturbing.